The Colonial Times of Hobart, Tasmania, announced on the 21st of May, 1852, the loss of the two British steamers. One was the HMS Birkenhead, and the other was the Amazon by fire. Per the Colonial Times, the Amazon sailed from Southampton on Friday evening with 156 people on board. At 9 p.m. on Friday night, the bearings of the engine became so hot that they were stopped until cooled. At 10, proceeded.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? Escape from the burning Amazon.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Royal Mail Steam Packet Company's brand new ship, the 3,000-ton Amazon, had been built specifically for rapid travel between Britain and the West Indies, carrying mail and passengers. She was launched on June 28, 1851, with great fanfare. Every description of her describes her as being the most modern vessel that the company could have achieved. She had every convenience possible for her passengers in their luxurious staterooms, and 800 horsepower engines to power her two side paddles and ensure their swift arrival at their destination. Just the luxurious interior fittings of the ship were estimated to have cost around £100,000 at the time of her launch. She was described as the largest timber-built steamship ever constructed in England. That she was timber-built was important, since she was intended for government contract work, and the British government was not particularly comfortable with iron-hulled steamships in 1851, though the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company had already gained permission to build a couple of iron-hulled steamships that would be even larger than the Amazon in the near future. On December 16, 1851, the Amazon arrived at Southampton, having completed her trial runs, and ready for her maiden voyage. Her first trip would be from Southampton to St. Thomas, a voyage that people estimated should only take her 14 days, which would break all speed records for that route. She was traveling with a cargo of £20,000 sterling and a large cargo of quicksilver, in addition to 50 passengers. She also had a crew of 110, including the officers and engineers, which meant that the total number of people most likely on board her was around 160, though accounts vary. In command of the Amazon for her first voyage was Captain Simmons, an experienced captain with a very good reputation for keeping his cool in difficult circumstances. The post on the Amazon was not to be his permanently, though. He had been assigned to the post temporarily because the captain who had been promised the post, Captain Chapman, was out of England at the time the Amazon was scheduled to take her first voyage. On Friday, the 2nd of January, 1853, the Amazon departed from Southampton at 3:30 in the afternoon and headed down the English Channel at 8 knots, a speed that at the time was called rapid. At around 9 in the evening on Friday night, after experiencing rain and headwinds, the bearings on the engine had become so hot that the ship had to stop for an hour for them to cool, and they did not resume the voyage until 10 that night. On several other occasions, the ship needed to be slowed to reduce the friction in the engine to prevent it from overheating further. This was not a matter for concern. Bearings overheating on new steamships for the first couple of voyages was a standard occurrence, and it just needed to be waited out. The rain and headwind were also not a cause for concern, and, therefore, Almost everyone was asleep on board the ship around midnight as the ship finally reached the entrance of the Bay of Biscay. Captain Simmons had spent the night observing both the weather and the workings of the engine, but even he had retired for the night, and therefore it was a midshipman named Mr. Vincent who was on watch to see smoke start to come from the fore hatchway at 12:40 in the morning. He sounded the alarm immediately, but the fire was already spreading rapidly. The crew was quick to respond, and everyone was soon on deck to find that the source of the fire was somewhere between the steam chest and the under part of the galley. But the flames started rushing up the freshly painted and dry timbers of the new ship. Whatever tools were at hand were put to use, trying to fight back the blaze. Deck pumps were employed to spray water on the deck, and wet clothes were used to cover hatches in the hope of depriving the fire of oxygen. But it was soon becoming clear that nothing was going to stop the spread of the fire. In the space of about 10 minutes, the fire was bursting through the hatchways of the ship. Most of the people on board the ship had been asleep when the fire alarm had been rung. And so the deck was filled with half-dressed people and frantic people, quickly, crew and passengers alike. One of the passengers, a man named Mr. Nielsen, had been worried about the condition of the engine, so he had been one of the last people to go to his berth, and therefore was able to get on deck faster than many. Captain Simmons had not given the order to launch boats yet, but it seemed like only a matter of time. When he saw another passenger on board wearing a life preserver, Mr. Nielsen realized he had left his belt in his cabin and went back for it. His trip back to his cabin caused him to see a true horror. The flames on the deck had burnt glass paneling, and the fire was now rushing aft, trapping several passengers who were trying to reach the deck. Mr. Nielsen tried to encourage other passengers to still risk the trip through the flames to reach safety, but he could not entice them to do so. So, instead, he rushed to the deck and shouted to the first officer, who was only wearing a shirt, to turn the helm so that the ship would be before the wind to try to control the direction the fire was traveling. The first officer did turn the wheel, but then abandoned the helm in his desperate attempt to try to assess how far the fire had already traveled. On seeing that the helm had been abandoned, Mr. Vincent, the midshipman who had originally found the fire, rushed to take it over to keep the ship in a more favorable position. Prior to taking the helm, Mr. Vincent had been helping with the launching of the ship's dinghy. Captain Simmons still had not given the order for the boat to be launched, but at this point, no one on board of the ship was waiting for the order anymore. It was later said that if Captain Simmons had given the order to prepare the boats when the fire was discovered, more lives might have been saved. But Captain Simmons had instead directed his attention to fighting the fire and trying to save the ship. And launching the boats proved to be difficult in any case. Launching small boats in stormy weather was never easy. But to make things even more complicated, the keels of the boats were held in place in iron cradles that they had to be lifted out of, making it even harder to get them ready to receive the people trying to get away from the burning boat. The mail boat was the first to be launched, with 25 people on board, but it was swamped and lost, with everyone on board. The pinnace was then launched, but it hung by the tackle which had not been released, and the waves swept everyone out of it. Again, everyone was lost. As the gig and the second cutter were being lowered, full of people, a large wave struck the ship's bow and unhooked the tackle of the gig, throwing it into the sea and swamping it. The same wave lifted the cutter's stern and pitched all but 2 men into the sea. The 2 men clung desperately to the cutter, screaming for help. 12 of the sailors had taken it upon themselves to try to lower the number 2 lifeboat, and passenger Mr. Nielsen came to join them. But the sailors told him to go back to the deck and employ the tackle to lift the boat. She was completely trapped by the iron cradle holding her keel. While Mr. Nielsen and one of the sailors were halfway through lowering the boat using the tackle, flames burst through the deck near them and drove them from their posts. Both men jumped onto the boat, followed by 2 other men. They were the last people to leave the ship. The boat was dragged along by the steamship, whose engines were still going until they could find an oar to fend her off from the cutter, which was still hanging from its tackle. And they could cut away the tackle still holding their boat and escape the ship, which was now an inferno. The escape from the burning ship had not been without incident for most of them. One man had caught his foot when it went through the wood of the burning deck, and he was badly injured. Another 2 of the men on board the boat had made 3 attempts to climb the starboard paddle box through the flames and smoke before they had finally succeeded, and they were able to climb down the face of the paddle box into the boat. 2 of the sailors who had been on watch below were able to reach the deck. These 2 were the last people to get in the boat, but both men had their hair catch on fire, and one of the men's beards was still on fire when he jumped into the boat. In total, there were 16 people on board of the lifeboat as she left the side of the Amazon. They were soon joined by the dinghy, which had been successfully launched by Mr. Vincent and 4 other people who had also been driven from the burning ship. The dinghy was already sinking, and so the 5 people from the dinghy joined the rest on the lifeboat. The people on the lifeboat now numbered 21, though only 3 of them were passengers. The people in the boat still had hoped to catch up to the Amazon and try to save anyone else who was still on board, but they were not able to catch up to the ship. It was still traveling around 8 knots, and the gale had become stronger. Soon, a large wave struck them, and the dinghy was sent to the bottom, while the lifeboat's rudder was entirely torn off, and the lifeboat was nearly swamped. They now had to focus on keeping themselves afloat in the storm. They were fighting the weather in this way when a bark passed between the burning Amazon and their little boat. The people on the boat gave a loud cheer, thinking they were saved, and the other ship acknowledged it, only to then sail off, leaving the people in the boat to continue their fight against the elements. The first thing to go on the Amazon was the mainmast, and then the foremast followed. The mizzenmast held out the longest, and by the time that it too fell, the hull was a solid mass of flames, and the chimneys of the ship were glowing hot. At about 4 in the morning, it rained heavily, but the waves died down some, and the lifeboat was able to put about and start to pull for the ship again. As they passed the stern of the ship, the fire reached the magazine and the ship's rockets exploded. The boat was unharmed, but it was a sign of the end. About 45 minutes later, the ship rolled over and sank. The people in the boat had no rudder, compass, food, or water. They also had only 12 oars, since they had thrown some to a voice they had heard in the water, hoping to give him a means of flotation before they could reach him, only to then be washed away by the stormy waves. Mr. Vincent was the highest-ranking officer on board, and he was also one of the only people fully dressed. He ordered that they begin to travel in the direction that they believed would bring them to the coast of France, and he offered up his jacket as a sail and his boots as a means to bail the ship. The people on the boat were divided into 2 watches, one under the command of Mr. Vincent, and the other under the command of Mr. Nielsen. It was due to this constant watch that they were able to see the sail coming towards them after they had been at sea for a day and a half. They immediately lowered their jacket sail and hoisted instead 2 handkerchiefs hoping that these would be more eye-catching. They clearly were, because at noon they were taken on board the bark, the Marsden, and brought to Plymouth, where they were met with a good deal of generosity and kindness. They all said that they believed that they were the only people to have escaped the ship. They were, luckily, incorrect. On the 6th of January, the Dutch ship, the Gertrude, landed 25 further survivors in Brest. These 2 boats had been among those that Mr. Nielsen had seen become swamped and unsuccessfully launched. What he did not realize, due to the chaos of what was occurring on board, was that the people who had been in the boats had been lost, but the boats themselves were still able to be used. One of the passengers, Mr. Glennie, a man who believed he was most likely the last person to successfully reach the deck, came to the deck only to hear a sailor report that both of the lifeboats were on fire. Not bothering to verify this for himself, Mr. Glennie saw one of the ship's other boats casting away from the ship, and after sliding down a rope to reach the sea, he swam for it. The boat he pulled himself into was the cutter that had the people thrown out of it by the wave. Mr. Nielsen had seen the 2 men still clinging onto the boat, but he had not seen Mrs. McLennan, who was holding her 18-month-old baby, also clinging onto it. For nearly half an hour, Mrs. McLennan clung to one of the benches of the boat with one arm and her baby with the other, hanging vertically until 2 of the ship's engineers rushed to free the boat and jumped into it so that they could escape the burning ship. They were amazed, when they got into the boat, to find that Mrs. McLennan and her child were lying in the bottom of the boat, exhausted but alive. Mrs. McLennan was in very rough condition, having been injured when the boat had tipped initially, and she had to lay for some time in the bottom of the boat with her child, even though she was only dressed in her nightclothes, and the bottom of the boat was quickly full of water. She also had to receive the news from the other people who were in the boat that her husband had been lost when the ship's magazine exploded. The shawl that Mrs. McLennan had wrapped around her child was given to the crew to be taken and used as a sail, but one of the sailors, named John Rogers, was not willing to see the weakened mother and child suffer. So he took off his cap, coat, and shirt and gave them to Mrs. McLennan. The only food on board the boat, a little bit of crab meat in the coat pocket of Rogers, was also given to the infant when he started crying for food. 17 hours after leaving her berth, Mrs. McLennan was lifted to the deck of the Gertrude, barely conscious, but still clinging to her baby. The only other female passenger to be saved was named Anna Mary Smith, and she had been traveling to join a family for a nanny position. She too was only in her nightdress when she rushed to the deck, though she had grabbed a blanket to wrap around herself. The first thing she was met with was one of the ship's officers, who told her that the ship was on fire, but everything was well, and carried her back to her berth, calling on a stewardess to help her get dressed. The stewardess was more panicked than Miss Smith was, though, and ran off down the hall. So, without getting dressed, Miss Smith once more headed on deck to find that the fire had grown a lot. And now, everything was chaos. She was lucky enough to find a boat that was already launched, and she swung herself into it. This boat proved to be the last filled out of any of the boats to escape the Amazon, though it was not for want of trying. For some time, the boat did its best to stay close to the Amazon, in the hopes that they would be able to rescue people out of the water, but they were not able to find anyone, and eventually gave up. When one of the sailors commented that they could use a sail, Miss Smith immediately offered up her blanket, and then made herself busy. Since they did not have many people on board their boat, the whole of the crew members on the boat were employed rowing until their hands were bleeding, and so the passengers were not able to remain idle either. One of the passengers, John Strybos of Belgium, took the helm but was not able to communicate with the English-speaking crew. Miss Smith therefore offered her skills as a translator, speaking to Strybos in French and the rest of the crew in English. 2 days later, they too were rescued by the Gertrude, which had already rescued the boat with Mrs. McLennan in it, and was now alert to the possibility of other survivors. Once the smaller boat was saved as well, though, the Gertrude could find no one else. A government ship was dispatched as soon as the second group of survivors arrived in Brest to look for any other boats. But they came back empty-handed, and everyone supposed that there would be no one else who had escaped the ship. It was, therefore, with amazement that people heard the news that the Helina, another Dutch ship, arrived in Plymouth on the 16th of January, with 13 more people on board. These survivors had by far had the closest escape. Among them was a passenger named Lieutenant Grillis, who would tell his story to the papers. When Lieutenant Grillis reached the deck, his first thought had been to help in any way that he could, and he offered his assistance to Captain Simmons to launch the lifeboats. Finally, while trying to launch one of the boats, the flames reached him and burned his hair, so he was forced to abandon his task and run aft through the fire. Feeling that he had done everything he could, and taking one last look at Captain Simmons, who was still trying to do everything possible to help passengers escape, Lieutenant Grillis threw himself into a boat that had already been swamped once. This proved to be one of the other lifeboats that had been believed lost, but he found that there were people who had also managed to climb into it after jumping from the burning ship. They managed to get away from the burning ship using planks as oars, since the ship's oars had been lost when the boat had capsized. But they soon found that they were filling with water. It was discovered that there was a large hole in her bottom when the ship had been lifted from her iron cradle with the tackle she had struck against it, and it had holed her. One of the ship's firemen took off his pants and shoved them into the hole, and the other people on board offered what they could: a sock, a hat, and a shirt, until the hole was no longer going to sink them immediately. They too saw the bark pass between them and the burning ship, but take no notice of them, and at dawn they could not see anyone around them. They passed over the wreckage of the Amazon, which was full of planking and floating chests, but no sign of any people, living or not. They saw another ship, but they had no sail unlike the other boats, and they were not able to catch up to her with their makeshift paddles. The next ship they saw in the afternoon, though, did spot them, and after 15 hours in the boat, they were also rescued. In total, 59 people were saved out of the estimated 160 people who had been on board of her when the ship caught fire. And even this was considered miraculous. No one was even entirely certain of what caused the fire. Some of the engineers and firemen speculated that, because the hot bearing caused oil to shoot out of the new engine they were still breaking in, some of it might have ended up on the felt around the boiler and caused the ship to catch fire. Some people pointed to having seen the storekeeper head to a storeroom with a lantern near the start of the fire. The storekeeper, who was among those who survived, pointed to freshly tarred coal sacks that had been piled between the boiler and the bulkhead. Some others said that they had seen stokers hang up red-hot tools on the bulkhead. The fact of the matter was that the fire had spread far too quickly to allow anyone to find the exact cause, only the general area it had started. It would remain a mystery. No fault would be found with how the crew handled the emergency, or the actions of the officers who had stayed with the ship until the end. Instead, The conversation would be one of many about whether or not steamships were really safe, if metal ships had their merits over wooden ships, about better fire safety on ships in general, and improvements that could be made to the way ship's boats could be stored. The discussion would be full of what-ifs, and questions about what might have been for the brand new ship that had taken over 100 people to the bottom with her. Steamships would still be made. Lifeboats would not be standardized for some time, and it would soon be found that iron ships were also capable of terrible and tragic fires. But the example of the Amazon would linger for some time in the public mind.
For more information, please see the Annual Register from 1852, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.